The DNA report sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. My hands trembled every time I walked past it. This innocent white envelope that somehow felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I was 74 years old, and I thought I knew all the secrets my life had to tell. I thought the chapters of pain and loss were closed, sealed away in the part of my heart I'd learned to lock up tight. But that envelope proved me wrong in ways I never could have imagined. When I finally tore it open on a Thursday morning in March, with my coffee growing cold beside me and the Iowa spring rain tapping against the window, I read 3 sentences that rewrote every memory I had of the most precious year of my life. The baby I had cared for 41 years ago. The child I had rocked and fed and loved with every fiber of my being. The little boy who disappeared from my life without explanation. He wasn't just some random infant I'd been hired to watch. He was my grandson, my own flesh and blood. The child of the daughter I'd given up for adoption when I was 17 years old. I sat there in my small kitchen in Des Moines, staring at those words until they blurred, and I understood with a clarity that felt like a knife to my chest why Ethan Parker could never call me Mom. Because I wasn't supposed to be his mom. I was supposed to be his grandmother. And somehow, impossibly, fate had brought us together for one brief, beautiful year before tearing us apart again. The cruelty of it, the cosmic joke of loving a baby who belonged to me in ways I didn't even know. It was almost more than I could bear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started, back when I was 32 years old and thought I was just answering an ad for a nanny position. Let me tell you about the baby with the brightest blue eyes I'd ever seen, and how he became the center of my universe for 12 perfect months. And then let me tell you about the family who vanished without a trace, leaving me with a broken heart and questions that wouldn't be answered for 4 decades. My name is Margaret Collins, and this is the story of the child I raised who wasn't mine, the daughter I never knew I had, and the moment when everything finally made sense, even though it broke me all over again. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you're watching this, you're about to hear a story that took me 41 years to fully understand. It's a story about loss and love, and the strange ways our past can circle back to find us when we least expect it. Stories like mine don't reach people without support from viewers like you. So if you could take just 2 seconds right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, it would mean the world to me. And if you're feeling this connection to my story already, a quick like tells the algorithm that this content matters, that stories about real women and real pain and real survival deserve to be heard. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your city or country and tell me what you're thinking so far. Every single one of your actions, every subscription and comment helps this channel grow and reach more people who might need to hear that they're not alone in their complicated journeys. There's a whole community building here, and your support is what makes it possible. Thank you for being part of this. I need to take you back to 1967 first, because that's where this story really begins, even though I didn't know it at the time. I was 17 years old, a senior at Roosevelt High School here in Des Moines, and I was pregnant. My boyfriend Danny and I had been careful, or so we thought, but life has a way of happening regardless of how careful you think you're being. When I missed my second period and took a test at the free clinic downtown, the nurse's sympathetic smile told me everything I needed to know before she even said the words. Des Moines in 1967 wasn't like it is now. Girls who got pregnant out of wedlock didn't have a lot of options, especially girls from working-class families like mine. My father worked at the John Deere factory, and my mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families over in Beaverdale. We lived in a small house on the south side, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and reputation mattered more than just about anything. When I told Danny about the baby, he went pale as a sheet. We were sitting in his Chevy Nova in the parking lot of Merle Hay Mall, and I watched him grip the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was 18, had a football scholarship to Iowa State lined up, and came from a family even more concerned with reputation than mine. His father was a bank manager. His mother was president of the Junior League. A pregnant girlfriend didn't fit into their plans for their golden boy. Danny offered to marry me. I'll give him that. He sat there in that car with tears in his eyes and said he'd do the right thing, that we could make it work somehow. But I could hear the desperation in his voice, could see the future unraveling behind his eyes, and I loved him. God, I loved him so much. But I loved him enough to let him go. I told him no. I told him I'd handle it on my own. Except I couldn't handle it on my own. Not really. Not at 17 with parents who cried when I told them, who looked at me with such disappointment that I wanted to die. Not in a time when being an unwed mother meant being whispered about, pointed at, treated like you'd committed some unforgivable sin. My parents made the arrangements. There was a home for unwed mothers up in Waterloo, about 2 hours north. I would go there for my last trimester, have the baby, and give it up for adoption to a good family through a private agency. That was the deal. That was how we would save face, save my future, save everyone from the scandal of it all. I went to Waterloo in February 1968, 5 months pregnant and terrified. The home was a large Victorian house that had been converted into a facility for girls like me. There were 11 of us there, all in various stages of pregnancy, all with the same story of shame and secrecy. We weren't allowed to use our real names. I was Mary for those 4 months. Just Mary. No last name because heaven forbid any of us could be tracked down later. I gave birth to a baby girl on May 3rd, 1968. They let me hold her for 10 minutes. 10 minutes to memorize every detail of her face, to count her fingers and toes, to breathe in that new baby smell and imprint it on my memory forever. She had a full head of dark hair like mine, and the smallest, most perfect little nose. Her eyes were that newborn gray-blue that all babies have, and I remember wondering what color they'd eventually turn. The adoption counselor told me she was going to a wonderful family, that they were educated and financially stable, and had been waiting years for a baby. She told me I was doing the right thing, giving my daughter a life I couldn't provide. She told me that in time, I'd heal and move forward, and maybe even have other children when I was ready, when I was married and settled. What she didn't tell me was the family's name. She didn't tell me where they lived. Private adoptions in Iowa in 1968 were sealed tight. There was no way to find out what happened to your baby once you signed those papers. No way to know if she was happy, healthy, loved. No way to ever see her again, unless she came looking for you herself after she turned 18. And even then, you had to have filed paperwork saying you were open to contact. Paperwork I didn't even know existed until years later. I went back to Des Moines in June 1968. I finished my GED since I'd missed graduation. I got a job as a waitress at Bishop's Cafeteria downtown. I lived with my parents and sent part of my paycheck home each week and tried to pretend that I hadn't left a piece of my soul in Waterloo. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. I threw myself into work, eventually moving up to assistant manager. By 1984, 16 years had passed since I'd given birth to my daughter. I was 33 years old, still unmarried, still living alone in a small apartment on the east side of Des Moines. I dated here and there over the years, but nothing ever stuck. Some part of me couldn't fully commit to anyone, couldn't imagine building a family when I'd already lost the first one I'd created. I had convinced myself I was content with my solitary life, with my job at the cafeteria, and my routine and my small circle of friends. Then I saw the ad in the Des Moines Register on a Tuesday morning in April. A family was looking for a live-in nanny for their infant son. They preferred someone mature, experienced, nurturing. The pay was generous and room and board were included. Something about that ad called to me. Maybe it was the chance to care for a baby again, to fill some of the emptiness that had lived in my chest since I'd held my daughter for those 10 brief minutes. Maybe it was just time for a change. Whatever it was, I called the number before I could talk myself out of it. The woman who answered had a warm voice with the slightest southern accent, something soft around the edges that made you want to trust her immediately. Her name was Catherine Parker, and she explained that she and her husband, Richard, had recently moved to Des Moines for his job at Principal Financial. They had a 3-month-old son named Ethan, and Catherine had just been offered an incredible career opportunity that would require her to travel frequently. They needed someone who could care for Ethan not just during the day, but around the clock when Catherine was away. Someone who would love him, like their own. We met at a Perkins restaurant on Fleur Drive the next day. Catherine Parker was 34 years old, elegant in a way that made my thrift store dress feel shabby. But her smile was genuine, and her handshake was firm. Her husband Richard was 42, distinguished-looking with graying hair at his temples and an air of quiet authority. But it was the baby who captured my attention completely. Ethan Parker was 3 months old and absolutely beautiful. He had the brightest blue eyes I'd ever seen, a shock of dark hair that stuck up in every direction, and the sweetest little smile that showed his gums. When Catherine asked if I wanted to hold him, I couldn't say yes fast enough. The moment she placed him in my arms, something clicked into place inside my chest. He looked up at me with those impossibly blue eyes and made a little cooing sound, and I was lost. Catherine must have seen something in my face because she smiled knowingly. We talked for over an hour about my experience, my expectations, my life. I was honest about everything except the one thing I couldn't speak about. The daughter I'd given up 16 years before. That was a secret I'd learned to keep locked away, something that felt too raw and too shameful to share with these polished, successful people. They hired me on the spot. I gave my 2 weeks' notice at the cafeteria and moved into the Parkers' home in West Des Moines on May 1st, 1984. It was a beautiful split-level house in a new development, the kind of place I'd never imagined living. My room was on the 2nd floor, next to Ethan's nursery, with my own bathroom and everything. Catherine had it all set up perfectly. A comfortable bed, a reading chair, even a small television. Those first few weeks were an adjustment. Catherine showed me Ethan's routine, his preferences, his little quirks. He liked to be bounced gently when he got fussy. He preferred his bottles slightly warm, not hot. He slept better with a specific lullaby music box that played Brahms. She had everything organized in detailed notes, schedules written out, emergency contacts highlighted in yellow. Richard worked long hours at Principal Financial, usually leaving before Ethan woke up and coming home after he was already in bed. Catherine's travel schedule was intense. She'd be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time, sometimes twice a month. It meant that more often than not, it was just me and Ethan in that big house, and I fell completely in love with that little boy. By the time Ethan was 6 months old, I couldn't imagine my life without him. He'd started Solid Foods, and I spent hours in that kitchen pureeing vegetables and fruits, talking to him the whole time about what I was making. He'd sit in his high chair and bang his little fists on the tray, babbling back at me in that baby language that sounds almost like real words if you listen hard enough. I was the one who saw his first tooth break through, who heard his first real laugh when I played peekaboo with a dish towel. I was the one who rocked him through his first ear infection, walking the floors at 3 a.m. with him whimpering against my shoulder. Catherine was grateful, always thanking me profusely when she came home from her trips, but I could tell that missing these moments hurt her. Sometimes I'd catch her watching Ethan and me together, with this look on her face that I couldn't quite read. Something like sadness mixed with something else I didn't understand. The Parkers were good people. I want to make that clear. They weren't cruel or neglectful. They loved Ethan deeply. But their lives were complicated in ways I didn't fully grasp then. Catherine was driven, ambitious, constantly striving for the next level in her career. Richard was quieter, more reserved, but there was a tension in him that I noticed in small moments. The way his jaw would clench when Catherine talked about her next trip. The way he'd pour himself a bourbon and sit alone in his study for hours. I didn't ask questions. It wasn't my place. I was the nanny, and they were the family, and those boundaries were clear even if the lines sometimes felt blurry, when it was just Ethan and me for days at a time. The months unfolded into a routine that felt like the life I was always meant to have. By the time Ethan turned 9 months old in December of 1984, he had become the absolute center of my universe. When Catherine asked what I wanted for Christmas, I laughed and told her I already had everything I needed, and I meant it. For the first time since I was 17 years old, I felt complete. Ethan was crawling by then, pulling himself up on furniture, constantly exploring the world with those bright blue eyes full of wonder and mischief. He had learned to say, "Ma, ma, ma," and while he said it to Catherine when she was home, he said it to me more often because I was the one who was there. Each time those syllables came out of his little mouth, my heart would squeeze with a joy so intense it almost hurt. I remember one morning in January, 1985. It must have been around 10 o'clock, because the winter sun was streaming through the living room windows at that perfect angle that made everything look golden. Ethan had just learned to clap his hands, and he was so proud of this new skill. He'd clap and then look at me with this huge grin, waiting for my reaction. So I'd clap back and tell him what a clever boy he was, and he'd laugh and clap again. And we must have done this for 20 minutes straight. Catherine was in California for a conference that week. Richard had left for work at his usual time. It was just Ethan and me in that house, and I was teaching him pat a cake, singing the rhyme my mother had sung to me when I was a child. When I got to put it in the oven for baby and me, he giggled so hard he got the hiccups, and I scooped him up and covered his face with kisses until the hiccups stopped. In that moment, holding that baby against my chest and feeling his little heart beat against mine, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like if he really were mine. If I were his mother instead of his nanny. If I could keep him forever instead of knowing that someday, probably someday soon, when he got older and Catherine's career settled down, I wouldn't be needed anymore. The thought of leaving Ethan made my chest ache, but I pushed it away. I had learned to live with ache. I'd been living with it since I was 17 years old, but I should have paid more attention to the small signs that something was changing in the Parker household. I should have noticed the way Catherine started looking at me sometimes, a strange expression crossing her face when she'd come home, and find Ethan reaching for me instead of her. I should have registered the increasing tension between Catherine and Richard, the hushed arguments I sometimes overheard late at night when I got up to check on Ethan, assessed narrative progress, and strategized section expansion. I need to continue developing the story. I've written about 600 words so far for the opening and context sections. Let me continue with the establishment of the life and then move into the warning signs section. I need to make sure I'm developing each section fully with the required word counts. Current progress. Section 1, opening. Approximately 700, 800 words. Section 2, context. Approximately 800 words so far. Need to reach 2,000 to 2,500 total. I need to continue Section 2 with more detail about the family dynamics, Margaret's daily life with Ethan, and setting up the foreshadowing of what's to come. The first real sign that something was off came on a Saturday morning in February. Catherine was home for the weekend, which was increasingly rare. I had gotten into the habit of making Ethan's breakfast, a bowl of oatmeal with mashed banana that he absolutely loved, and I was at the stove stirring the pot when Catherine came into the kitchen. She was wearing her silk bathrobe, the expensive one with the embroidered collar that she'd brought back from a trip to San Francisco, and her hair was still messy from sleep. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, and stood there watching me prepare Ethan's breakfast without saying anything. The silence stretched out until I felt compelled to fill it. I was thinking we could take Ethan to the science center today, I said, keeping my voice light and friendly. They have that new dinosaur exhibit that's supposed to be great for little ones. Catherine took a sip of her coffee, still not responding. When she finally spoke, her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. Margaret, he's only 10 months old. He won't even remember going to a dinosaur exhibit. I turned from the stove, surprised by her tone. Well, no, of course not. But it would be fun in the moment. He loves looking at colorful things and... I think Richard and I will take him today, Catherine interrupted. You should have the day off. Take a break. Go see a movie or something. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion. I got every Sunday off and usually one other day during the week when Catherine was home. But something about the way she said it felt like a dismissal, like she was reclaiming something I'd been holding that belonged to her. I smiled and nodded, swallowing down the small hurt that rose in my throat. Of course, that sounds lovely. He'll love spending time with both of you. But as I finished making Ethan's breakfast, and Catherine took the bowl from me without meeting my eyes, I felt the first whisper of unease. It was nothing I could name, nothing specific enough to worry about. Just a feeling, like when you walk into a room and know something has changed, even though you can't point to exactly what it is. The unease grew over the next few weeks in small, almost imperceptible ways. Catherine started coming home earlier from her trips when possible. She began working from home more often, setting up a temporary office in the spare bedroom so she could be there during the day. At first, I was happy about it. I thought maybe she'd realized how much she was missing and was trying to find a better balance. But then I noticed how she'd take Ethan from me the moment she emerged from her office, even if he was perfectly content playing on the floor with his blocks. I noticed how she started giving me more tasks that took me away from Ethan, asking me to run errands, to reorganize the kitchen cabinets, to do extra laundry, even though we had a service that came twice a week. The breaking point came in late March, on a Wednesday afternoon that started out perfectly normal. I was giving Ethan his lunch, tiny pieces of grilled cheese and apple slices that he was learning to feed himself, when Catherine came home unexpectedly. She wasn't supposed to be back from her trip to Chicago until Friday. She walked into the kitchen and stopped short when she saw us. Ethan had grilled cheese smeared across his face and was laughing at something, and I was wiping his hands with a damp cloth while making silly faces at him. When he saw Catherine, he smiled and reached his little arms toward her, saying, "Ma." But I could swear there was a split second of hesitation, like he had to think about it first. "Catherine, you're home early," I said, standing up. "Is everything all right?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at Ethan and me, and her face went through a series of expressions I couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "The conference ended early. Can you give us a moment? I need to talk to Ethan alone." Talk to Ethan alone? He was barely 10 months old. But I nodded and excused myself, going to my room and closing the door. I told myself I was being paranoid, that, of course, a mother wanted private time with her baby after being away. But my heart was pounding in my chest for reasons I couldn't fully explain. That evening, after Ethan was in bed, Catherine asked me to join her and Richard in the living room. I knew before I sat down that something was wrong. The formal way they positioned themselves on the sofa, the serious set of Richard's jaw, the manila folder Catherine was holding in her lap. It all pointed to something I didn't want to acknowledge. "Margaret," Catherine began, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the folder. "We need to talk about your employment." The words hit me like cold water. My employment. Have I done something wrong? No, nothing like that. Richard jumped in quickly. "You've been wonderful with Ethan. Truly exceptional. It's just that our situation is changing." Catherine took a breath and continued. "I've been offered a position that will allow me to work from home full-time. It's actually a promotion. Better pay. More flexibility. And Richard and I have been talking, and we think it's time for me to be Ethan's primary caregiver again. We think it's important for him to bond with me more, to not get confused about who his mother is." The last part felt like a knife slipping between my ribs. "Confused? Ethan isn't confused. He knows you're his mother. I've never tried to." "We know that," Catherine said quickly, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. "We're not saying you did anything wrong. We're saying that as Ethan gets older, it's important that he has a clear understanding of his family structure. And the truth is, Margaret, you've become so important to him that sometimes I wonder if he even thinks of me as his mother, or just as some woman who shows up occasionally." The tears came before I could stop them. "But he loves you. He always reaches for you when you come home. He says mama to you." "He says mama to you too," Catherine said quietly. "And that's the problem. I know this is hard. I know you love him. But we think this is what's best for our family." They were giving me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to pack up my life with Ethan, to say goodbye to the baby who had become everything to me. They were paying me 2 months severance, which Catherine said was generous. They would provide a glowing reference. They hoped we could part on good terms. I moved through those next 2 weeks like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant. I memorized every detail of Ethan's face, every sound he made, every little gesture. I took pictures with Catherine's Polaroid camera when she wasn't looking, slipping them into my purse to keep. I recorded his laugh on a cassette tape, playing it back to myself late at night when I couldn't sleep. On my last day, I held Ethan for a long time. He was almost 11 months old, so close to walking, so close to saying real words. I kissed his dark hair and breathed in his baby smell and told him I loved him, even though he couldn't understand what that meant, even though he'd probably forget me before he turned 2. Catherine cried too when I left. She hugged me and thanked me and said I would always be welcome to visit, that she'd keep in touch. Richard shook my hand formally and pressed an envelope into my palm with an extra $1,000 that he said I deserved. I moved into a small efficiency apartment on the south side of Des Moines. I got my job back at Bishop's cafeteria. I tried to rebuild the life I'd had before Ethan, but it felt hollow and empty in ways I couldn't articulate. I called the Parker house twice in the following month, wanting to check on Ethan, wanting to hear Catherine tell me he was doing fine. Both times a recording said the number was no longer in service. I drove by the house in West Des Moines one afternoon, in June. There was a for sale sign in the yard. The windows were dark. The neighbors I flagged down said the family had moved suddenly. Something about a job transfer out of state. No, they didn't know where. No, they didn't have a forwarding address. The Parkers had vanished, taking Ethan with them, and I had no way to find them. For months afterward, I grieved like I'd lost my own child. In a way, I had. I'd lost him twice now. First when he was born, and I'd given him up, and now with Ethan, whom I'd been allowed to love only to have him taken away. I spiraled into a depression that took me years to climb out of. I threw myself into work, into keeping busy, into not thinking about the baby with bright blue eyes who I'd never hold again. The years passed. I never married. I never had other children. I worked at the cafeteria until I retired at 65, then took a part-time job at a bookstore to keep myself occupied. I made friends, had hobbies, lived a life that looked full from the outside. But there was always an emptiness inside me, a space reserved for the children I'd loved and lost. I need you to understand what those 40 years were like, living with questions I could never answer. I thought about Ethan constantly, especially on his birthday. May 3rd, the same day I'd given birth to my daughter 16 years earlier. What were the odds? I'd asked myself that so many times. What were the odds that I'd end up caring for a baby born on the exact same day my daughter was born? But I never imagined the truth. Never in my wildest dreams could I have guessed that the coincidence ran so much deeper than a shared birthday. The truth started to reveal itself in December 2025, when I was 74 years old. I'd been living alone in my small house in Des Moines for decades, comfortable in my solitude, when I got a message on Facebook from a woman named Jennifer Parker. The name Parker made my heart skip a beat before I even opened the message. "Dear Margaret Collins," it read, "You don't know me, but I'm trying to locate someone who worked for my parents, Catherine and Richard Parker, in 1984 and 1985 in Des Moines, Iowa. They hired a nanny named Margaret Collins to care for my brother Ethan. If this is you, I would very much like to speak with you. This is a matter of some importance regarding my family history. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." My hands shook so badly I could barely type a response. Yes, I was that Margaret Collins. Yes, I'd cared for Ethan. Yes, I would love to speak with her. Within minutes, Jennifer had sent me her phone number and asked if I could call that evening. When I dialed her number at 7 o'clock sharp, my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice warm but with an undercurrent of tension that I recognized immediately. "Margaret? Is it really you?" "Yes, it's me. You said you're Ethan's sister. The Parkers never mentioned they had a daughter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Jennifer spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "That's because I was their daughter, before I was their sister, before they adopted Ethan. I need to ask you something, Margaret, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, anything." "Did my mother ever tell you anything about where Ethan came from, about his adoption?" The word adoption hit me like a physical blow. "Adoption? Ethan was adopted?" "You didn't know?" Jennifer sounded surprised. "They told everyone he was their biological son, but I found papers after my mother died last year. Ethan was adopted through a private agency in Iowa. The adoption was finalized when he was 3 months old, right before they hired you." My mind was reeling. Catherine and Richard had adopted Ethan? They'd never told me. They'd let me believe he was their biological child. Why would they hide that? Margaret, I need to ask you something else, Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. My mother kept a diary. I found it when I was going through her things. She wrote about you, about how loving you were with Ethan, about how attached he became to you. But there was one entry that I can't get out of my head. She wrote that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd put you in an impossible situation without knowing it, and that when she found out the truth, she panicked and ran. The truth? What truth? The truth about who Ethan really was. Margaret, do you have any children? Did you ever give a child up for adoption? The question made the room tilt. I had to sit down. How do you know about that? Because my mother's diary mentioned it. She wrote that she'd been going through the adoption paperwork one day and found something that made her dig deeper. She contacted the agency, which she wasn't supposed to do, and she found out information that she wasn't supposed to have access to. Information about Ethan's biological grandmother. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The pieces were falling into place, but my brain couldn't quite accept what they were forming. Margaret, my mother wrote that Ethan's biological mother was a young woman named Sarah Hutchins. Does that name mean anything to you? Hutchins was the name the adoption agency had given to the family who adopted my baby. The adoptive family's last name. I'd only heard it once when the counselor had told me my daughter was going to the Hutchins family. Oh my God, I whispered. My mother wrote that Sarah Hutchins was 16 when she got pregnant with Ethan. She was the daughter of adoptive parents who were horrified when they found out she was pregnant. They arranged for a private adoption through the same agency they'd used to adopt Sarah. And when my mother dug deep enough, she found out that Sarah had been adopted by the Hutchins family in May of 1968, born to a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Collins. I started crying, great heaving sobs that I couldn't control. Ethan wasn't just some random baby I'd cared for. He was my grandson, my own daughter's son. My daughter, whom I'd given up when she was 10 minutes old, had given birth to Ethan when she was 16. And then Catherine and Richard had adopted him. And then they'd hired me to care for him, not knowing who I was. My mother felt terrible, Jennifer was saying through my tears. She wrote that she didn't know what to do. She wanted to tell you, but she was afraid of what would happen. She was afraid you'd try to claim Ethan, that there would be legal issues, that everything would blow up. So she made the decision to let you go and to move the family away before you could find out the truth. Where is he? I managed to ask. Where's Ethan now? He lives in Minneapolis. He's 41 years old, Margaret. He's married, has 2 kids of his own. He never knew he was adopted until my mother died and he found the papers. It's been devastating for him, finding out that his whole life was built on a lie. He's been trying to find his birth mother, trying to understand his identity. I tracked you down because I thought you might know something that could help him. I never imagined you were his biological grandmother. She gave me Ethan's phone number. She told me he was open to contact, that he desperately wanted to know his biological family. She said he remembered me vaguely from baby pictures Catherine had kept, but he didn't know who I was or what role I'd played in his life. Before I could call him, though, I needed to know for certain. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining this impossible connection. Jennifer helped me arrange a DNA test through an online service. Ethan submitted his sample. I submitted mine. And then I waited for 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. The report arrived in that white envelope, the one that sat on my kitchen table for 3 days while I worked up the courage to open it. When I finally did, when I read those 3 sentences, confirming that Ethan Parker was indeed my biological grandson, that my daughter Sarah had been his mother, that the baby I'd loved with all my heart had been mine in ways I'd never known. It was like being torn open and put back together at the same time. Now I'm sitting here at my kitchen table with that report in front of me, and I know what I have to do. I have to call Ethan. I have to tell him everything. I have to explain that his grandmother loved him for 12 months before she even knew he was her grandson. I have to try to build a relationship with this man who is a stranger to me, but who I held when he was small enough to cradle in my arms. But before I make that call, I need to talk to you. I need to tell you this story because I think there are other women out there who gave up babies and wonder what happened to them. I think there are other women who've loved children who weren't theirs and had to let them go. I think there are other people who've discovered that their family history is more complicated than they ever imagined. And if you've made it this far in my story, if you're feeling the weight of what I've just shared, then I need to ask you something. If you haven't already liked this video, would you do that now? Would you leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from? And maybe share what you're feeling about all of this? And if you think this story deserves to be heard by more people, would you hit that subscribe button? Because your support, every like, every comment, every subscription, that's what helps this channel grow. That's what helps me keep telling these stories that need to be told. We're building something here. A community of people who understand that life is messy and complicated and sometimes heartbreaking, but we survive it together. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Let me tell you about the phone call. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in early January 2026, 3 days after I'd opened that DNA report. I'd been working up the courage all weekend, going back and forth between feeling like I had to call immediately and feeling like I should wait, like I should give him more time, like I should somehow prepare better for what I was about to do. But how do you prepare to tell someone that you're their grandmother, that you cared for them as a baby without knowing you were family, that his mother, your daughter, was someone you held for only 10 minutes before giving her away? I made myself a cup of tea first. English breakfast with 2 sugars and a splash of milk, the same way I'd been making it for 50 years. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in front of me and the piece of paper where I'd written Ethan's number. My hands weren't steady, but they weren't shaking as badly as they had been. I picked up the phone and dialed before I could change my mind. It rang 3 times. Then a man's voice answered, deep and warm, with just a hint of uncertainty. Hello? Ethan Parker. My voice cracked on his name. Yes, this is Ethan. Is this Margaret? Yes, it's me. Jennifer told me she'd spoken to you, that she'd told you about me. She did. He paused, and I could hear him take a breath. I've been waiting for you to call. I wasn't sure if you would. I'm sorry it took me so long. I needed time to process everything, to understand what this means. Ethan, did Jennifer tell you? Did she tell you about the DNA test? She told me that you're my biological grandmother, that my birth mother was your daughter. Another pause. I've been sitting here trying to figure out what to say to you, and I keep coming back to one question. Did you know? When you were taking care of me, did you have any idea? No, I said, and the tears started again. I swear to you, I had no idea. If I had known, if I had even suspected, I would never have let them take you away. I would have fought for you. You have to believe that. I do believe you. Jennifer showed me some of my mom's diary entries, the ones about you. She wrote about how much you loved me, how gentle and patient you were, How you sang to me constantly. She wrote that she felt guilty every day for letting you go, but she was terrified of what would happen if you found out the truth. I closed my eyes, remembering Catherine's face that last day, how she'd cried when I left. She should have told me. She should have trusted me with the truth. I know. I'm angry at her too, even though she's gone. I'm angry that she kept so many secrets, that she built our whole family on lies. Finding out I was adopted was hard enough. Finding out that my nanny was actually my grandmother, that we had this connection that no one told us about. It feels like my entire childhood was based on some elaborate deception. I understand that anger, I said softly. I've been angry too. Angry at your mother for hiring me and then firing me. Angry at myself for not asking more questions, for not pushing harder to stay in your life. But mostly, I've been heartbroken. I lost you twice, Ethan. I lost you when your mom let me go. And before that, I lost your mother when I gave her up for adoption. I've been living with that loss for 40 years, not knowing that the baby I loved so much was my own grandson. Margaret. He stopped, seemed to gather himself. Can I ask you something? Do you remember anything specific about me? About when I was a baby? I remember everything, I said immediately. I remember that you had this little cowlick that stuck up no matter how much I tried to smooth it down. I remember that you loved this one stuffed elephant, the green one with the floppy ears, and you'd drag it everywhere. I remember that you'd laugh this belly laugh when I'd blow raspberries on your stomach, and that you'd fall asleep in my arms every afternoon, around 2 o'clock, like clockwork. I remember that you were just starting to try to walk when I left, pulling yourself up on the furniture and taking these wobbly steps before sitting down hard on your diaper. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't remember you. I wish I did, but I don't remember anything from when I was that little. But I've seen pictures. My mom kept a whole photo album, and there are dozens of pictures of me as a baby, and you're in a lot of them. When Jennifer showed them to me after we found out the truth, I looked at your face in those photos, and I could see how much you loved me. It's right there in your eyes. I did love you. I do love you. Even though I haven't seen you in 40 years, even though you're a grown man now with your own family, you're still that baby to me. You're still Ethan, my grandson. I'd like to meet you, he said suddenly. I'd like to bring my wife and kids to Des Moines, if that's okay. They should meet their great-grandmother. And I need to know you. I need to understand this part of my history. My heart felt like it might burst. I would love that. I would love that more than anything. We made plans right there on the phone. He would drive down from Minneapolis the following weekend. He'd bring his wife, Angela, and their 2 children, a daughter named Emma, who was 8, and a son named Michael, who was 5. We'd meet at my house, somewhere neutral and comfortable. We'd take our time, let the relationship develop naturally, see where it went. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and cried for an hour straight. They weren't sad tears, though. They were something more complicated. Grief mixed with joy, loss mixed with recovery. The weight of 40 years of not knowing suddenly lifted off my shoulders. But even as I cried, I knew this was only the beginning. Meeting Ethan would answer some questions, but it would also raise new ones. We'd have to navigate this complicated relationship, figure out how to be family when we'd been strangers for so long. We'd have to deal with the grief of all the time we'd lost, and I'd have to tell him everything about his mother, my daughter, the baby I'd held for 10 minutes, and then never saw again. Because that was the other piece of this puzzle that still haunted me. What had happened to Sarah? Where was my daughter now? Jennifer had told me that Catherine's diary mentioned Sarah had moved away after Ethan was born, that the Hutchins family, the people who'd adopted her, had cut off contact with Catherine and Richard after the adoption was finalized. Sarah would be 57 now, the same age I'd been when I retired from the cafeteria. Did she know I was trying to find her? Did she even know that I'd been part of Ethan's life? Did she blame me for giving her up, or had she made peace with it like I'd tried to do? These were questions that haunted me as I prepared for Ethan's visit. I cleaned my house obsessively, going through every room and making sure everything was perfect. I bought groceries for a small army, not sure what Ethan's kids would like to eat. I put up pictures around the house, old photos of me, of my parents, of the house I grew up in. I wanted him to see where he came from, to understand his roots. The night before they were supposed to arrive, I barely slept. I kept imagining what it would be like to see Ethan as an adult, to look into his face and see if I could still see the baby he'd been. Would he have my eyes? My smile? Would there be any physical resemblance, or had his father's genes won out? His father? That was another mystery I hadn't solved yet. Who had gotten Sarah pregnant when she was 16? Was it someone she loved, or was it something darker? Jennifer hadn't mentioned anything about Ethan's biological father in her messages to me, and I didn't know if that meant she didn't know, or if she was waiting to tell me in person. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. I was up at 5, too nervous to sleep any longer. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the street for any sign of their car. They weren't supposed to arrive until noon, but I couldn't help myself. Every vehicle that passed made my heart jump. When a silver Honda CR-V finally pulled into my driveway at 12:15, I thought I might faint. I stood up from the window, smoothed down my sweater. I'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on a simple blue cardigan and black pants, and walked to the front door on legs that felt like they might give out. I opened the door before they could knock, and there he was. Ethan Parker, 41 years old, standing on my front porch with a woman beside him and 2 children peeking out from behind their parents' legs. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with broad shoulders and dark hair that was starting to show gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that made me gasp. Those bright blue eyes that I'd memorized when he was a baby were still the same, still impossibly blue, still looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Margaret," he said, and his voice broke on my name. I opened my arms, not sure if he'd accept the gesture, not sure if it was too much too soon. But he stepped forward and hugged me, and I held my grandson for the first time in 40 years. He was so big, so solid, so different from the baby I'd rocked to sleep 1,000 times. But underneath the difference, underneath the years and the distance, he was still Ethan. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were crying. Angela, his wife, was wiping her eyes too. The children looked confused but patient, clearly having been prepared for this moment to be emotional. "Come in," I managed to say. "Please, come in out of the cold." We spent the afternoon in my living room, drinking coffee and hot chocolate, and talking. Ethan told me about his life, how he'd grown up in Minneapolis, how he'd become a high school history teacher, how he'd met Angela at a teachers' conference in Chicago. He told me about Emma and Michael, about their school and their hobbies and their quirks. I told him about my life, too, about the years I'd spent working at the cafeteria and then the bookstore, about my friends and my routines. I showed him pictures of my parents, his great-grandparents, telling him stories about the house I'd grown up in and the neighborhood where I'd played as a child. But eventually, We had to talk about the harder things. Ethan wanted to know about Sarah, about his biological mother. I told him everything I could remember about the pregnancy, about going to the home for unwed mothers, about holding her for 10 minutes, and then never seeing her again. I told him about the agency, about how private adoptions worked in 1968, about how I'd never been able to find her, because the records were sealed. "I've been trying to find her too," Ethan said quietly. "I hired a private investigator right after I found out I was adopted. He's been working on it for 6 months. But Iowa adoption records from the 60s are nearly impossible to unseal unless both parties agree to it. And we can't find Sarah to ask her to agree." "What do you mean you can't find her?" I asked. Ethan exchanged a look with Angela before answering. The Hutchins family moved away from Iowa in 1990, after Sarah left for college. We tracked them to Arizona, but Mr. and Mrs. Hutchins both passed away in the early 2000s. Sarah apparently moved to California after college, but after that, the trail goes cold. The investigator found a couple of Sarah Hutchinses in California, but none of them are the right age or have the right background, so she could be anywhere. The thought made my chest hurt. I'd spent 40 years wondering about my daughter, and now that I knew she'd given birth to Ethan, now that I had some connection to her again, she was still lost to me. "We're not giving up," Angela said gently. "We'll keep looking. And maybe now that we've found you, maybe you'll remember something about the Hutchins family or the agency that could help us track her down." I tried to remember, sifting through memories that were 40 years old and clouded by the pain of that time. The Hutchins family? I'd only heard the name once, from the adoption counselor. But there had been paperwork, hadn't there? Papers I'd signed, documents with details I'd been too upset to read carefully. "The adoption agency was called Family First," I said slowly. "They were based in Waterloo, on Main Street, in a brick building next to a bank. I remember because I had to go there 3 times. Once for the initial meeting, once to sign the papers after Sarah was born, and once for a follow-up a month later." "Family First," Ethan repeated, pulling out his phone and typing notes. "That's good. That's more than we had before." We talked for hours until Emma and Michael started getting restless, and Angela suggested they should probably head to their hotel. Ethan had booked rooms at a Holiday Inn near the airport, planning to stay for the weekend so we could have multiple visits. Before they left, I asked if I could take a picture with Ethan. Angela pulled out her phone and snapped several shots of the 2 of us standing in my living room, my arm around his waist, both of us smiling through our tears. Then I asked if I could get one with all of them, my grandson and his wife and their children, my family. After all these years of being alone, I had family again. That night, after they'd gone, I sat in my quiet house and looked at the pictures Angela had texted to me. There was one in particular that made me catch my breath. Ethan was looking down at me with such warmth in his eyes, and I was looking up at him with my hand on his chest, right over his heart. You could see the resemblance in that photo, the similar shape of our eyes, and the angle of our cheekbones. You could see that we were family, but you could also see 40 years of absence, 40 years of not knowing each other, 40 years of missed birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments. That loss wasn't something we could ever get back, no matter how many visits we had or how close we became. Over the following months, Ethan and I built a relationship. He drove down from Minneapolis once a month, sometimes bringing the family and sometimes coming alone. We talked on the phone every week, long conversations where we slowly filled in the gaps of each other's lives. I learned that he loved history as much as I did, that he had my tendency to overthink things, that he bit his lower lip when he was nervous, just like I did. But even as we grew closer, there was a piece missing. Sarah, my daughter, his mother. The person who connected us, but who wasn't there. In March, Ethan's private investigator finally had a breakthrough. He'd found a Sarah Hutchins living in Portland, Oregon, who was the right age and who had records showing she'd been born in Iowa. The investigator had sent her a letter explaining that her biological mother and her son were trying to make contact and asking if she'd be open to a conversation. We waited 3 weeks for a response. 3 weeks where I barely slept, where every time the phone rang I jumped, where I imagined 1,000 different scenarios of what Sarah might be like now, what she might say to me. The letter came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was addressed to me, care of the private investigator, and inside was a single page covered in neat handwriting. "Dear Margaret," it began. "I received your letter through the investigator, and I've spent the past few weeks trying to decide how to respond. I won't lie. Finding out that you've been looking for me, that you met Ethan, that you were his nanny without knowing he was your grandson, it's overwhelming in ways I can't quite express." My hands shook as I kept reading. "I've known I was adopted since I was 12. The Hutchins family never hid that from me, though they made it clear they didn't want me trying to find you. When I got pregnant at 16, it was history repeating itself in the worst way. I was ashamed and scared, and I let my adoptive parents pressure me into giving Ethan up just like you'd given me up. I've lived with that decision every day for the past 41 years. There was more. Paragraphs about her life, about how she'd moved to Portland after college and built a career as a social worker, about how she'd never married or had other children, because she couldn't stop thinking about the son she'd given away. She wrote about finding out about me through the investigator, about the shock of learning that I'd cared for Ethan as a baby. "I'm not sure I'm ready to meet you yet," the letter concluded. "I have a lot of complicated feelings about everything. About being given up for adoption, about giving Ethan up, about you being in his life when I couldn't be. But I am open to talking. I've included my phone number below. If you want to call me, I'll answer. And if Ethan wants to call me, I'd like to talk to him too. I think we all deserve to at least try to understand each other, even if it's 40 years too late." I called her that night. My daughter, Sarah, answered after 2 rings, and the sound of her voice, soft and uncertain, with a slight tremor that reminded me of myself, made me break down completely. "Sarah, baby, it's me. It's Margaret. It's your mother." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then I heard her crying too. "I never thought this day would come. I never thought I'd hear your voice." We talked for 3 hours that first night. We talked about everything. The circumstances of her adoption, her childhood with the Hutchins family, the pregnancy with Ethan, the pain of giving him up. She told me about her career, about the work she did helping other young mothers navigate the foster care and adoption system, about how she'd devoted her life to making sure other women had more support than she'd had. I told her about my years of wondering what happened to her, about the guilt I'd carried for giving her up, about how I'd tried to make peace with it and failed. I told her about Ethan, about the 12 months I'd spent loving him without knowing he was hers, about how it felt to discover the truth 40 years later. "Mom," she said at one point, the first time she'd called me that, and it made my heart stop. "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that I don't blame you for giving me up. I understand why you did it. You were 17. You didn't have support. It was 1968. I get all of that. But you blame me for something," I said, hearing the hesitation in her voice. I blame the circumstances. I blame a system that forced young women to give up their babies instead of helping them raise them. I blame the secrecy and the shame and the way adoption was handled back then. But I don't blame you as a person. You were a child yourself when you had me. Those words, that absolution, meant more to me than she could possibly know. We made plans for her to fly to Des Moines in April, to meet me in person for the first time since I'd held her as a newborn. Ethan would come down too, and the three of us, 3 generations torn apart and finally coming back together, would sit in my living room and figure out how to be a family. That meeting happened on a Saturday in mid-April, under the same bright Iowa sky that had witnessed so much of my life. Sarah looked like me. That was the first thing I noticed when she walked through my door. She had my dark hair, now streaked with gray, and my same pointed chin. But she also had features I didn't recognize, traits from her father Danny that had skipped me entirely. Ethan arrived an hour later, and watching him meet his birth mother for the first time was one of the most beautiful and painful things I've ever witnessed. They hugged for a long time, both crying, while Sarah kept saying, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," over and over. The 3 of us spent that entire weekend together, talking through 40 years of separation and pain and questions. We looked at old photos. Pictures Sarah had of herself as a child, pictures I had of Ethan as a baby, pictures of me and my parents. We found the similarities in our faces, the ways we all shared certain gestures and expressions. We also talked about the future. Sarah wanted to be part of Ethan's life going forward, wanted to know her grandchildren. Ethan wanted his kids to know both their grandmother and great-grandmother. I wanted all of it. I wanted the family I'd never been allowed to have, even if it came 4 decades later than it should have. Now, here we are. It's January 2026, exactly a year since I opened that DNA report and learned the truth about Ethan. So much has changed in 12 months. I talk to Sarah twice a week now. She flew to Des Moines for Christmas and met Emma and Michael for the first time, becoming the grandmother she'd thought she'd never get to be. Ethan brings the family down once a month, and we're building traditions, creating new memories to replace the ones we missed. But there are still hard moments. Times when Sarah and I talk about the past and the grief becomes overwhelming. Times when Ethan asks questions about his father. Sarah told him the truth, that it was a high school boyfriend who never knew she got pregnant. And we have to sit with the fact that there's a whole other side of his family he'll never know. Times when I look at Emma and Michael and think about how I should have been there for Ethan's childhood, how I should have been able to watch him grow up. The pain doesn't go away completely. I don't think it ever will. But it's changed. It's transformed from the sharp, fresh agony of not knowing into something softer, something that includes joy and gratitude, alongside the grief. I have my daughter back. I have my grandson. I have great-grandchildren who call me Gigi and climb into my lap to hear stories. After 74 years of living with loss, I finally have the family I always wanted. Catherine Parker died 2 years ago, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about her, about the choices she made, the secrets she kept. I understand now why she panicked when she discovered the truth. She must have felt trapped between doing the right thing, telling me who Ethan really was, and protecting her family and her son from a situation that could have become legally and emotionally messy. I don't forgive her exactly. How can I forgive someone for robbing me of 40 years with my grandson? But I understand her. I understand the impossible situation she found herself in, the fear that drove her decisions. And in a strange way, I'm grateful to her. She gave Ethan a good life. She loved him. She kept pictures of me, which meant he could see proof of our connection when the truth finally came out. She wrote in her diary about her regrets, which gave Jennifer the clues she needed to find me. As for the family, my family, we're figuring it out as we go. Sarah is seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of her adoption and the trauma of giving Ethan up. Ethan is learning to navigate having two mothers, learning to give each of us the space we need, while also building relationships with both of us. I'm learning to be a grandmother and great-grandmother, learning that family isn't just about biology, but about showing up and being present and choosing each other every day. We're planning a big family gathering for this summer. Sarah is flying in from Portland. Ethan and Angela and the kids are driving down from Minneapolis. We're going to spend a week together, really getting to know each other, creating the foundation for whatever this family becomes. I'm 74 years old. I spent most of my life alone, convinced that I'd lost my chance at having a family of my own. I spent 40 years mourning children I'd loved and lost, never knowing that one of them, my grandson, had been right there with me for 12 precious months. But I know now. And while I can't get back the time we lost, while I can't erase the pain of those 40 years, I can choose what happens next. I can choose to show up for Ethan and Sarah and those beautiful great-grandchildren. I can choose to build something new from the broken pieces of our past. That's what I want to leave you with. If you're watching this and you've given up a child, if you're wondering what happened to them, if you're living with that same grief I carried for so long, please don't give up hope. Please keep the door open, even just a crack, because sometimes, in ways we can never predict or plan for, life gives us a second chance. If you've made it all the way to the end of my story, I want to thank you. From the bottom of my heart, before you go, I have one more request. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you feel something or think about your own life differently, would you leave a like? Would you subscribe to this channel so you can hear more stories like this? Would you drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from? And maybe share what this story meant to you. I'm building this channel from scratch, sharing these stories because I believe they matter. I believe that women like me, women who've lived full, complicated lives, full of pain and loss and unexpected joy, deserve to have their stories told. Every subscription brings me closer to being able to dedicate more time to this channel, to reaching more people with these messages of hope and survival and resilience. Your support makes that possible. We're creating a community here, and you're part of it. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember this, it's never too late to find your family. It's never too late to heal old wounds. It's never too late to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair. I'm living proof of that. At 74, I found the family I thought I'd lost forever. If it can happen for me, it can happen for you too. I'm Margaret Collins, and this is my story. The story of the baby I raised who wasn't mine, the daughter I gave up, and the moment when everything finally made sense. It took 41 years, but we found each other. And now we're building something new, something beautiful, something that was worth waiting for. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this journey. And if you're out there searching for someone you lost, if you're holding on to hope that someday you'll find them, keep searching, keep hoping. Because sometimes, against all odds, love finds a way home.